Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. Remember my copy says Sasquatch. Ignore what the picture says. Yes, today's chapter, Bigfoot Arrives. Wasn't aware he went anywhere. Let's get started. Incidents at Bluff Creek. The events of 1958 unfolded themselves with ever-increasing speed before an astonished and bewildered public that found itself torn between excitement and skepticism. Perhaps the stories got such wide coverage because reports about the Yeti had been filling the international news media for some years. Cryptozoology, though the word had not really caught on, was an acceptable news topic. Another reason was the availability of dramatic photographic evidence. Any reporter will confirm the fact that a good photograph will give legs to a story and ensure that it continues to run, while the same story without a picture would soon die down and lose public interest. The trail of events actually began in 1957, when work began on building a road through the Bluff Creek area of Northern California. It was designed to aid the logging industry by opening the region up to heavy machinery. Ray Wallace was the head of the firm hired to do the job. His brother Wilbur was one of the team foremen in charge of the tasks of clearing a flat road bed through the rugged and densely forested terrain. The Wallace Company was an established construction outfit in the area and was running more than one project. It was only after the event that workmen at a Wallace site near Mad River remembered that they had found some strange tracks in March 1958. Nobody could recall exactly what they looked like. At least one man said they were bear tracks, while another said they were faked by some unidentified prankster who wanted to spook the workmen. At this distance in time, it is impossible to state anything definitive about this event, except that it was odd but quickly dismissed at the time. It is only later events that have given it any importance. On August 3rd, the workmen on the Bluff Creek Road turned up for work to find some of their equipment disturbed. A spare tire weighing around 700 pounds had been rolled about, causing the men to wonder who or what had been interfering. On August 27th, the workmen discovered that the site had again been visited by something odd overnight, but this time it had left footprints. It was Gerald Crew, known as Jerry, who found them. They were impressed into the soft soil around his bulldozer. The footprints were later described as being exactly like those of a naked human foot, but much larger. At first, Crew thought that they must be some sort of practical joke, but after following the tracks about and studying them more closely, he became convinced that they had really been left by a huge man of some kind. He went to see his foreman, Wilbur Wallace, who came to look at the tracks. After some discussion, it was decided to ignore the strange nocturnal invader, as long as he did not turn up in daylight hours when the work crews were on site. On September 21st, the local newspaper, the Humboldt Times, printed a letter from Mrs. Jessie Bemis about the events up at Bluff Creek. Jessie Bemis was the wife of one of the workmen on the site. The letter prompted the editor, Andrew Gonzoli, to dig out some old stories along similar lines. Reporter Betty Allen then made the link between the mysterious giant footprints and the stories that had been circulating for years about a hairy man-ape that the white settlers and farmers called Bigfoot. Allen went out to talk to people who had actually seen the tracks of the man-ape. On September 28th, she had a piece published about the creature she called Bigfoot, which summarized the evidence to date. She also suggested that next time somebody found any footprints, they should take a cast using plaster of Paris. Solid evidence. Then, on October 1st, Jerry Crew and the work gang at Bluff Creek found more footprints that had been left overnight around their work site. Two of the workers promptly quit. Wilbur Wallace asked his brother and boss, Ray Wallace, to come up to Bluff Creek and to go over the situation. Meanwhile, Jerry Crew called an old friend of his, Bob Titmus, who went to see Betty Allen to get some plaster of Paris and instructions on how to use it. On October 3rd, Titmus arrived at the worksite and together with Crew poured the plaster into the clearest of the footprints. The cast was taken down to the offices of the Humboldt Times by Crew. The man and the cast were photographed, and the amazing photograph was used to illustrate an article by Andrew Gonzalez. It was the combination of a stunning photo, solid evidence, and well-researched writing that propelled Bigfoot into the national media. The story was taken up and reprinted across the USA and Canada, and then filtered out to media in other countries. Back at Bluff Creek, the excitement mounted when, on October 12th, two workers, Ray Kerr and Bob Breezel, actually sighted the mysterious footprint maker. Driving along a local dirt road after dark, they momentarily caught a gigantic upright figure in their headlights. The creature ran off into the woods, but the two men described a hairy human figure well over 6 feet tall. Within 48 hours, another 13 men had left their jobs on the road construction project. Meanwhile, Bob Titmus was out in the forests, looking for signs of the mysterious creature. So far as is known, he was the first man ever to go looking for Sasquatch. He found some more footprints and took casts. In the meantime, the events around Bluff Creek, followed by the newspaper reports, had attracted two Yeti investigators, John Green and Rene Dahinden. These two men were in touch with a Texas millionaire named Tom Slick, whose interest in mystery animals and other odd phenomena made him willing to invest money in research. Also on the scene fairly quickly was the zoologist Ivan T. Sanderson, who was writing a book about North American ecology at the time. With hindsight, it is clear that the 1958 events on the Bluff Creek Road construction site were crucial to the development of the Bigfoot enigma. First of all, the news story alerted the outside world to the existence of a large, hairy, man-like creature living in the forested hills and mountains of the Pacific Northwest area, something the locals had known for years. But secondly, it also galvanized a key group of men who would, in varying ways, have a dramatic impact on future research into what was then called Bigfoot. Titmus, Green, and Dahinden would all devote huge amounts of time, effort, and money to the search for the mystery creature. Between them, they amassed a vast number of footprint casts, eyewitness accounts, hair samples, and other evidence. Sanderson would become the first, and for many years the only serious scientist, to recognize that there might be something in the reports. Slick would continue to provide the funds that made the work of the previous four possible. Ray Wallace would play an enigmatic and hardly controversial role as the self-confessed perpetrator of all sorts of wild claims and hoaxes related to Bigfoot. Others, such as Crew and Allen, would drop out of the story fairly quickly. Of all these men, the most controversial proved to be Ray Wallace. For a start, he is known to have possessed a pair of gigantic wooden feet, with which he went about faking Bigfoot tracks. Then he claimed that he had photographed and filmed Bigfoot on several occasions. At another time, he said that he had killed one of the creatures and had hidden its body away, though he never actually produced it. A repeated claim was that Bigfoot lived in caves high in the mountains where they stored vast caches of gold nuggets. Wallace said that his motive for planting fake tracks was the desire to protect these gold stores. He was, most people agreed, a prankster with a unique sense of humor. After his death in 2002, one of his relatives went so far as to claim that Wallace invented Bigfoot, and that he had been responsible for nearly all the evidence that supported the idea that a giant man-ape existed in the Pacific Northwest. The reality is that Bigfoot just died, the newspapers announced after Wallace's death. Practical Joker. The big question that has never been properly answered to anybody's satisfaction is just when it was exactly that the prankster Wallace began faking giant footprints. Some skeptics believe that he was directly responsible for the footprints discovered by Jerry Crew. They allege that Wallace's company was falling behind with its work, and that Ray Wallace wanted to come up with a bona fide reason for an extension to the deadline. If some of his workers quit due to a monster scare, he could plead for more time. On the other hand, Wallace was away from the state on business when at least some of the tracks appeared, and it would be physically impossible for him to have faked all the evidence that had accumulated since 1958. Those who believe in the reality of Sasquatch are more inclined to believe Ray Wallace took to his hoaxing as a result of the events on the Bluff Creek Road construction site. As an established practical joker, Wallace realized the possibilities of the events that had fallen into his lap and set out to exploit them. Whatever the truth of Wallace's involvement, the events were significant for a number of other reasons. The fact that the newspapers and radio stations were suddenly putting out stories about Bigfoot prompted many people to step forward and give public accounts of their encounters with the creatures. In general, these added little that was new to the picture that was being built up, but they did indicate that there was far more evidence doing the rounds than a few giant footprints around a construction site. Without doubt, though, the reports also encouraged people who had encountered the creature or its footprints to come forward more readily to talk to the newspapers, or to supply information to one or other of the new breed of researchers. This contributed to the massive increase in the numbers of reports being made of the creature and the tracks it left behind. Reports multiply. An early instance came from Hidden Lake in British Columbia in the summer of 1959. Mr. and Mrs. Bellevue were out camping in the area, as they had done several times before. One evening, Mrs. Bellevue wandered off in search of firewood. Then she suddenly saw a human-like figure watching her from the cover of some trees. The figure was about 6 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown hair. Mrs. Bellevue retreated to the campsite, but decided against mentioning anything to her husband in case of ridicule. Later that night, though, she felt that it would be best if they were to leave the area. She suggested the idea, and her husband replied that he had also been getting a very strong feeling that they weren't welcome. As the pair packed up next morning, they heard something big, heavy, and bipedal moving in the dense undergrowth nearby, although they did not see anything. The true importance of the 1958 events and the stories that followed them was not realized for many years. In fact, the subject still provokes controversy among those who study the Sasquatch. First and foremost, the publicity surrounding the events opened the collective eyes of the North American public to the fact that there might be a gigantic man-like ape roaming the backwoods. As we have seen, one effect of this was that people were more willing to come forward with reports about the Sasquatch, but members of the public also began to confuse the Sasquatch with other animals. For instance, people from urban backgrounds traveling through rural areas would often see a bear and report it, in all good faith, as a Sasquatch. Their lack of familiarity with wildlife was the cause of such mistakes. These false sightings continue to bedevil research into the Sasquatch. It can take a good deal of work to distinguish between a genuine encounter and such a false report. Glowing eyes. Far more controversial is a string of sightings of Sasquatch in areas where they had not been reported for generations, and where common sense would suggest that the density of human population would mean that they should not be found. One of the first of these came from Davis, West Virginia, in 1960. A group of young men were camping out in some woods. One of them felt a sudden dig in his ribs. Thinking it was a friend wanting his attention, he turned around. Instead of a friend, he found himself looking at an 8-foot-tall figure covered in long, shaggy hair all over its body. The creature had enormous eyes that glowed as if with some sort of inner fire. After frightening the teenager, the beast walked off into the trees. It was not immediately obvious from the early reports, but some researchers began to suspect that the Bigfoot that was being reported from the forests of the eastern United States was distinct from the one being reported in the Pacific Northwest. It began to be termed the Eastern Bigfoot, as if it were a different species. As the records of sightings and encounters grew in the decades that followed, the differences between the two types of Bigfoot or Sasquatch would become increasingly pronounced. Different again was the strange creature that began to be reported from Florida and the surrounding area. This soon acquired the name of skunk ape, both because of its offensive smell and because it appeared to be much more like an ape than a hominid. The reports began to be made public in the early 1960s, after the Bluff Creek events had opened up the press to such stories. One important early sighting took place south of Clanton, Alabama in 1960. The Reverend E.C. Hand and half a dozen others saw an ape of some sort bounding along beside Route 31. They called Sheriff T.J. Lockhart, who found two sets of tracks, one larger than the other. The larger footprints were about the size of a man's foot, with the big toe sticking out sideways, while the smaller footprints were identical in shape but half the size. In 1962, a Kentucky farmer named Owen Powell spotted what he reported as a gorilla on his land. It was about 6 feet tall when it stood up on its hind legs, and it was covered in black fur. In 1967, Howard Deason of Oklahoma became almost friendly with what he thought was a chimpanzee, perhaps escaped from a zoo. He left out pieces of fruit for it and watched it at fairly close range off and on for about 3 years. In 1968, Hamburg in Arkansas was the site of several fleeting sightings of a similar creature. As with the eastern Bigfoot, it took some time for researchers to realize that most reports coming from the southern states, and especially from Florida, were describing something that seemed to be different from the Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest. In this case, the creature seems to have been very much more like a conventional ape. The hind feet of chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas all have a big toe that sticks out sideways, more like a thumb. This is because they use their hind legs for grasping as well as for walking. Nor do they habitually walk on their hind feet, but instead they will walk on all fours. When they do this, they curl their hands into loose fists and support themselves on their knuckles. This way of moving demands a particular kind of bone structure in the hind foot, one that allows the big toe to remain prehensile. It was to become gradually clear that the apes being seen in the damp or swampy forest lands of the southeastern states of the United States were apes of this kind, though no such creature were recognized by science. In the immediate wake of the 1958 Bluff Creek events, however, all this lay in the future. At the time, all that anyone was prepared to accept was that a large number of reports of footprints and sightings were being made. Then, in 1961, Larry Martin reported a dramatic confrontation with a Sasquatch in the wooded hills above Alpine, Oregon. He had gone into the woods early one evening to help a friend retrieve a deer that he had shot. The two men drove up a dirt track to a spot close to the kill, then set off on foot. When they reached the spot where the deer should have been, it had gone. A clear drag mark led towards a patch of dense undergrowth. So intrigued, the two men followed. As Martin entered the bushes, they were suddenly shaken with great violence by unseen hands. Suddenly a Sasquatch came into view. It was only a few feet away. It was about 7 feet tall. It stood upright and it had the head and face of a gorilla, Martin later reported. He did not stay to find out more, but screamed and fled rapidly, followed by his friend. The Sasquatch gave chase with long, loping strides that thumped the ground, but the two men leapt into the car, started the engine, and raced off. As he glanced in the rear-view mirror, Martin saw the Sasquatch standing just a few yards behind them, watching them go. This incident is interesting because of the light it casts on Sasquatch behavior. First, it would seem that the Sasquatch had stumbled across the dead deer and decided to take possession of it, presumably so that it could eat the flesh. It had then dragged the deer into cover. This is the typical behavior of an animal seeking to protect a carcass from scavengers and other predators. When Martin and his friend approached, the Sasquatch waited until they were close to the deer, then began shaking the bushes. Again, this is fairly typical behavior for an animal that perceives itself to be under threat. Gorillas, chimpanzees, and other apes will routinely shake bushes with great violence when they want to frighten off an intruder. The performance can create an enormous amount of noise and movement for minimal effort, and so it often scares off a new arrival. In this case, it did not work, so the Sasquatch resorted to a personal appearance. Interestingly, the Sasquatch did not catch up with Martin and his comrade. It seems unlikely that a 7-foot-tall hominid could not outpace someone under 6 feet tall. This raises the distinct possibility that the Sasquatch did not really want to catch the humans. Perhaps it just wanted to drive them away from the disputed deer kill. Once that had been achieved, it was probably content to watch them go. Presumably, it then went back to feast on the deer carcass. In the spring of 1961, a woman walking near Bella Coola Inlet, British Columbia, had an encounter that again shed light on Sasquatch behavior. She saw a female Sasquatch, which she could identify by its large breasts, walking along a river bank. Alongside it walked a juvenile Sasquatch, which was holding the adult by the hand. It was a very maternal and remarkably human-looking scene. A few weeks later, in June, a Sasquatch made a dramatic visit to the isolated farm of Robert Hatfield near Fort Bragg, California. Later one evening, the farm dogs began barking loudly. Hatfield went to investigate, and from his front porch saw a hairy head peering over the 6-foot fence that surrounded the yard. Thinking it was a large bear, he went back into the house to fetch his brother-in-law Bud Jenkins, who happened to be staying. While Jenkins fetched a torch and a rifle, and his wife, Hatfield's sister, peered out into the darkness, Hatfield went back out into the yard. Hearing a noise from around the corner of the house, he went to investigate and almost bumped into a hair-covered human-like figure that stood almost 8 feet tall. Hatfield fled, tripped, and continued on his hands and knees. He dashed into the house at top speed, screaming at his sister to shut the door. She went to close the door, but it jammed while still slightly ajar. Something was holding it open with great force. By this time, Jenkins had found his rifle and was stepping past the terrified Hatfield. "Let it through," he told his wife. "I'll get it." He lifted his rifle into the shooting position and prepared to fire at whatever it was that was about to come through the door. As the woman hesitated, the door suddenly went slack. She slammed it shut and bolted it securely. Jenkins then walked to the window to peer out into the darkness. He saw a human-like figure striding off. It stepped over a 3-foot-high fence without pausing, and then faded out of sight into the darkness. In July, a creature approached a car that contained 2 teenage courting couples. It was parked in an isolated lane. The 4 youngsters reported that the beast bounded along on 4 legs and then stood up on its hind legs to peer in at them. It growled menacingly and then fled, moving and behaving rather like the creature that would later become known as the skunk ape. The next month, at Stony Lake, back in British Columbia, Alex Lindstrom reported seeing a grayish-colored Sasquatch. It was about 8 feet tall, and it fled as soon as it spotted him. Lurking in a graveyard. In August, John Bringsley was out picking huckleberries near Nelson, British Columbia. After parking his car, he wandered off into the woods with a basket. He did not hear anything, but on looking up from his task of picking berries, he saw a Sasquatch walking hesitatingly and slowly toward him. The creature stood about 8 feet tall, and it was covered in grayish hair. At a distance of less than 50 feet, the two looked at each other for a moment in silence, and then Bringsley fled for his car. The last time he saw the Sasquatch, it was still close to the huckleberry bush. It was watching him leave with what seemed to be curiosity more than anything else. It is possible that the Sasquatch seen by Lindstrom and Bringsley were in fact the same creature. Grey is not a colour that is often reported among Sasquatch. What is reported, however, is that a Sasquatch or a group of them will be seen in an area on several occasions over a short period of time, and then seem to vanish. It is as if they have arrived, spent some time in an area, and then moved on. In August, an eastern Bigfoot put in an appearance near Richmond, Indiana. This creature was reported to be about 6 feet tall and covered with white fur. It had glowing red eyes and was seen lurking in a graveyard. A similar creature was to be seen in November, standing in a creek near Decatur, Illinois. However, the main focus of Sasquatch activity remained in the Pacific Northwest. In August, Mrs. Calhoun was prospecting with her daughter near Fresno, British Columbia. The pair had found a stream that looked like a likely spot for panning, and the daughter had gone back to the car to fetch a packed lunch. When Mrs. Calhoun heard a noise, she glanced round to see that a creature was watching her from the fringes of the forests that grew down to the stream's banks. The beast was very human in appearance, though its arms were too long in proportion to its body, and it was covered in pale brown hair. Its head and shoulders were covered in longer, densely matted hair, and the top of its head sloped up and back to a point, while the nose was broad and flat. Mrs. Calhoun swung her rifle up to her shoulder and covered the beast as she began to edge along the stream towards her car. The Sasquatch watched her for a few seconds and then stepped back into the undergrowth and slipped out of sight. Mrs. Calhoun was convinced that it was still watching her and that it followed her to her car. In October, a man named Dutch Holler saw a Sasquatch. It was about 7 feet tall and was walking casually through woodland near Spokane, Washington State. A few days later, another Sasquatch was seen by Joe Gregg as he drove along a highway near Yarrow, British Columbia. It walked casually across the road in the beams of his headlights and then slipped away into the woods. On January 27, 1963, the police at Tulum, California took a telephone call from a man who said that he had seen a 10-foot-tall hairy giant in some woodland. Sheriff Bill Huntley picked up a local tracker named Albert Miller and went to investigate. Both men thought that the caller had probably seen a large bear, so they expected to find bear tracks. They found no bear tracks, as they call the area of woodland, but they did hear a terrifying scream that sounded like a man who was in terrible agony. Wondering if the caller had been attacked by the bear, Huntley called out. He was answered by another scream, but this time from a different direction. Huntley and Miller soon concluded that there were 2 or more things in the forest that were circling around them, so they retreated to their car. The creatures continued to call for some time, and then the cries seemed to come from further and further away until they faded into the distance. The creature in the clearing. The Huntley-Miller incident has a place in Sasquatch research because this was the first time a Bigfoot call had been reported. Earlier witnesses had reported whistles, grunts, gurgles, and even growls, but this unearthly scream was something new in 1963. Almost exactly a month later, on February 28th, a pilot claimed that he had taken the first photographs of a Sasquatch. Leonard Strand and Alden Hoover were flying over wilderness forest land near Confidence, California, when they spotted an odd creature in a clearing. It could only be described as half bear and half gorilla. Strand had a camera with him, so he took some photographs. When they were developed, they had been affected by camera shake, probably caused by the vibration of the light aircraft's engine. All that could be made out was a darkish blur that looked vaguely human-shaped. In June 1963, Stan Matson reported that when he had been walking alongside the Lewis River Canal near Yale in Washington State, he had seen a female Sasquatch carrying a baby under its arm. As soon as he saw the creature, he froze, and so escaped detection. For several minutes, he watched as the Sasquatch squatted down by the canal and reached repeatedly into the water. Each time, its hand was withdrawn from the water to put into its mouth. Matson was not close enough to see for certain, but he got the impression that the Sasquatch was catching small fish. Elsewhere on the Lewis River, this time near its confluence with the Columbia River in Oregon, another Sasquatch was seen. This time the witnesses, Mr. and Mrs. Martin Henrik, were spotted by the creature which fled into some woodland. They reported the event to the local press, and the story was spotted by John Green. He hurried to the scene and was able to take plaster casts of the 16-inch tracks that had been left behind by the creature. This was one of the very first times that casts had been taken of footprints that could be definitely linked to one of the Sasquatch that were being reported. Previously, the footprints that had been found in woods or rural areas had not been accompanied by a sighting. When Sasquatch were seen, it had either been on hard ground or it had rained soon afterwards and spoiled any prints that might have been made. It had been only conjecture that the giant footprints were being made by giant human-like creatures. This combined sighting and footprint casting finally seemed to confirm that the two phenomena were indeed aspects of the same enigma. A number of reports made in the early 1960s revealed the fact that the relationship between Sasquatch and dogs was one of mutual animosity. At Toppenish in Washington State, in the spring of 1963, a woman heard her watchdogs barking first in alarm and then in fear. It was late evening and dusk was closing in, but the woman went to peer out of the window to see what was going on. She received a terrible shock when she saw a huge ape-like face peering back at her. The Sasquatch seemed to be just as surprised as she was, because it fled. In July of the same year, a Sasquatch approached the home of Gladys Herrera, an isolated house near Satis Pass, Washington State. Again, the first sign of anything unusual was the frenzied and terrified behavior of Herrera's pet dog. In October 1968, the Quarry Homestead near Yakima, Washington State, was visited by a Sasquatch which was around 7 feet tall. The family dog attacked it, but the Sasquatch simply slapped it aside. When Mike Corey emerged from his house, the Sasquatch made off into the woods. 2 days later, the dog was found dead. It had been savagely beaten to death, presumably by the Sasquatch. A report made to the indefatigable John Green in the summer of 1963 showed that Sasquatch were not always hostile. A man out hunting deer around Mount Shasta fell and injured his leg so badly that he could barely hobble. He was seriously alarmed when he was approached by a pale-colored Sasquatch that stood about 8 feet tall. The Sasquatch watched him for a while, then came forward and picked the terrified man up and carried him to the nearest road. Because the Sasquatch did him no harm, the man presumed that it was trying to help by carrying him to a road that it knew was frequented by humans. Soon afterwards, a camper named Harry Squinnis had his own close encounter with a Sasquatch when camping near Anaheim Lake in British Columbia. After entering his tent, he had just climbed into his sleeping bag when he heard a noise outside. He sat up, whereupon the tent flap was very roughly pulled aside, and what he described as a gigantic monkey face was thrust in. Squinnis grabbed a torch, whereupon the creature disappeared. He followed it outside and was alarmed to see 4 Sasquatch, all within 20 feet of his tent. When he shouted at them, all of the creatures walked off into the forest and did not return. In the summer of 1964, a driver spotted a Sasquatch standing beside a lay-by near Elmsey, Oregon. The creature was bending down to peer through the windows of a parked station wagon. When the driver pulled up, the Sasquatch fled. Inside the car was a sleeping man who had been the object of the creature's attention. Needless to say, he left hurriedly when he was woken up and told what had been happening. In July 1965, a Sasquatch was seen swimming some distance away from the shore of Princess Royal Island, British Columbia. The fishermen who saw it realized with no little apprehension that it was actually swimming for his boat, so he started up his outboard motor and sped off. At this point, 4 more Sasquatch appeared on a nearby beach and watched him. The sighting added swimming to the reported skills of the Sasquatch. This could have been inferred from the fact that Sasquatch had been seen on offshore islands, but it was the first time that one of these creatures was actually seen swimming. It is not generally realized that swimming is unusual among apes. Most apes cannot swim. Humans and Sasquatch are among the few that can. That autumn brought the apparent evidence that Sasquatch were not just confined to stealing deer from human hunters, they could actively hunt on their own account. Herb Brown was out hunting near LaPorte, California, when he saw 4 deer moving through the forest. Behind them came a Sasquatch that was moving very carefully and quite silently, as if it were stalking them. The creatures moved out of sight before Brown could see the result of what seemed to be a hunt. An interesting piece of hearsay, it could not really be called evidence, surfaced at the Tollgate restaurant in the Blue Mountains of Washington State. The owner of the establishment has an interest in Sasquatch and encourages his customers to tell him of any encounters. One customer handed over a photograph which showed a dead cougar beside a Sasquatch footprint. The customer said that he had been following a Sasquatch trail in the area when he came across the dead cougar. It had been killed by having its skull crushed by a rock. Nearby were the bones of a deer, picked clean and heavily gnawed. He concluded from this that the Sasquatch had stolen the deer killed from the cougar, and when the big cat objected, the creature had killed it. Unfortunately, the customer did not leave his name or contact details, so the story cannot be checked in any way. The bizarre Eastern Bigfoot. Meanwhile, the Eastern Bigfoot was being seen less often than its Western counterpart, but in increasingly bizarre circumstances. Lou Lister had been driving his 18-year-old future wife home. When the young couple pulled over to the side of the road that led to the girl's farmhouse home near Point Isabel in Ohio, we saw an unnaturally tall human-like figure approaching over a field. The thing moved in a series of bounding leaps. Lou switched on the car's headlights to get a better look at the creature. It was tall, 2-legged, and covered with yellowish blonde hair, while its enormous eyes glowed a blazing orange. As soon as the headlights came on, the creature began running towards the car. Passing through a wire fence rather than jumping over it, it then began to attack. It reached in through the open window and tried to grab Lister, but he managed to duck aside and right up the window. The girl, meanwhile, felt mesmerized by the creature's orange eyes. After the creature curled back its lips to reveal its hideous fangs, it dropped down onto all fours, snarled, and vanished into thin air. Another apparent Eastern Bigfoot attack took place on September 13, 1965. Christine Van Acker, aged 17, and her mother were driving through woods near Monroe in Michigan. It was a balmy night, and the pair had the car windows down. Suddenly, a hulking great figure stepped out of the trees and stood in the road. It was about 7 feet tall and covered in dark hair. Christine, a novice driver, tried to swerve past it and accelerate, but succeeded only in stalling the car. Seconds later, the creature was beside the car and reaching in. The smell was overpowering. It put a hairy hand on Christine's head and banged it against the steering wheel, and then it turned and walked off as another vehicle approached. Even more terrifying was the Bigfoot encountered by James Crabtree when out squirrel hunting near Fouke, Arkansas in 1965. He saw some horses bolting across a field and heard what he thought was a dog howling in pain. Going to investigate, 14-year-old Crabtree found himself suddenly confronted by something that was 8 feet tall, human-shaped, and covered with reddish hair. The beast's face was completely featureless, apart from a broad nose and masses of cascading hair. This hairy being began moving toward Crabtree with solid, lumbering steps. Crabtree raised his shotgun and blasted the creature at a range of about 25 feet. But the shot had no effect, so he shot again. Again it had no effect. This time the boy lifted the gun so that its barrel was pointing at the Bigfoot's head. At a range of under 10 feet, he pulled the trigger, but still the beast came lumbering forward. Crabtree fled and got away uninjured. Equally odd, though reported in all good faith, was the 7-foot-tall Bigfoot covered in glossy black fur that was reported to be strolling through a park in Morristown, New Jersey on May 21st, 1966. Odd behavior. It was not only in the eastern states that these creatures could appear to behave oddly. In May 1967, 2 teenage girls spotted a Sasquatch in woods near Dallas in Oregon. It was an 8-foot-tall, hairy, man-like creature. Their encounter was unremarkable in itself. It fitted into what was becoming a pattern for the Pacific Northwest. When they fled, the animal followed them for a short distance, then seemed to lose interest before wandering off. It was the sequel that was so unusual. The girls told their friends about the encounter, and on the following day, no fewer than 12 teenagers, some armed with guns they had borrowed from their families, returned to the site of the encounter. The teenagers split up to search the woods for the Sasquatch. Dennis Taylor and Dave Churchill came across it first. They were pushing through dense undergrowth when they spotted a crouching, hairy, ape-like beast in the dim light under a tree. Although it was crouching, the creature was at least 7 feet tall. It began to stand up, whereupon Churchill shot it in the chest with both barrels of his 12-gauge shotgun at a range of under 20 feet. The impact of the blast knocked the creature over, but it then stood up and calmly walked off as if uninjured. Bulletproof wonders. These bizarre encounters were mostly with the eastern Bigfoot, though at this date the creature was not yet recognized as being distinct from the Pacific Northwest Sasquatch. Researchers who believed in the reality of a hominid ape that was native to North America tended to look askance at these encounters. The aggressive, bulletproof wonders that were able to vanish into thin air simply did not fit into the pattern of a real creature that the researchers were trying to build up. Some of them ignored the wilder reports altogether. Others included the incidents in their writings but glossed over the more inexplicable features. On the other hand, the skeptics, who thought that the entire Bigfoot Sasquatch enigma was a fraud or a hallucination, seized on these bizarre reports with tremendous enthusiasm. They could use them to portray the entire story as the stuff of delusion, nonsense, and fraud. By the summer of 1967, the world outside the Pacific Northwest had been aware of the Sasquatch for 9 years. What had begun as an intriguing mystery relating to the gigantic footprints that had been found around a road construction site had mushroomed dramatically. Hundreds of people had reported finding footprints, seeing man-apes in the forests, and having encounters with the beasts that seemed to have come straight out of a horror movie. Some investigators were convinced that the Sasquatch was a real creature. Others were giving up in despair because of the sensational and otherworldly aspects of the phenomenon. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific Northwest, a temporarily unemployed rodeo rider was setting out on a journey that would turn the world of cryptozoology upside down. Roger Patterson was heading to Bluff Creek with a movie camera, and what he recorded continues to dominate all discussion of the Sasquatch to this day. Well, very strange, isn't it? Oh, and if you're wondering about this specific chapter's title with big and foot being separate, that is actually how it's written in the book. In fact, early uses of the name did have it as being separate. It wasn't until the 50s that it was all joined into one word. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you all next time. See ya!